Oh, thank God. Okay,
Yeah.
so yeah, this is about the future of coding emails once Outlook's updated itself, which I'll talk about timescales for that in the talk, because the things I'm talking about today can't necessarily use immediately. But I do want to start just by talking briefly about my own sort of journey and history of email, just because I think my experience is really common. And I know obviously this event today brings together people that are passionate about email and love email. But for a lot of developers, I think an email is something that they have to do once in a while, and that it's quite stressful. And I think that's why email development is its whole own career path for some people, because coding a web page and coding an email still are so different. And so for me, I remember in my first job, first coding job as a front end developer, I was working on a couple of e-commerce websites. I was already contributing to CSS tricks. I was totally in love with CSS and felt really confident with HTML. And then one day, it's kind of out of the blue, I was tasked with coding up an email. And I thought, okay, well, it's just CSS and HTML, and there's no back-end programming languages, and there's no JavaScript. So it should be my bread and butter, really. And I just remembered feeling so frustrated because I felt like I should know how to do this. Because, as I say, I felt like I knew HTML inside and out, and I knew CSS inside and out. And I just was sort of pulling my hair out, and I crammed as many email resources as I could. I think I even spent money on an ebook to try and learn it all. And I think it was probably like a few days that I spent on like one single email. And it did get sent, but it definitely didn't look 100%. Um, so I think that's a pretty typical experience for people that don't specialize in email. And I'm going to talk about how email and the web sort of diverged and are to a limited degree going to reconverge. And I'm going to start by just having a really quick history of basically like layout on the web and CSS. So the very first website ever, which is still available online, basically looks like this. It has no real layout to speak of. CSS actually didn't even exist yet. Um, so super simple. And then within a few years, they added the table tag to HTML, which was for tabular data. It was for this kind of thing. But relatively quickly, though, people did start using this for layout because there really was no other options. It was kind of all they had. And this was popularized by this book by somebody called David Siegel. And this was a very different era in web design. Kind of love looking back at all these super retro websites. Um, so these all would have been done with tables, although certainly if I had in my career gone and coded a website with tables, like I would have been fired because this is now thought of as like a really bad practice. And this was obviously before responsive design, so um, a lot fewer considerations back then. And then just quite slowly, you had the transition as people started using CSS more. People started arguing for web standards, and at the time, we were really limited to floats and for display inline block. Floats were really designed for this kind of layout where you have text flowing quite often around an image, but you can float text around anything. It can sort of wrap around another piece of text, like with a pull quote, as I've shown on the example on the right here. I think this is something you very, very often see in print design. And even though you've been able to do it on the web for a really long time, you don't see it that often. But this was really what floats were good for and were designed for. But given the lack of other options. People did unfortunately try and build whole entire grid systems just using floats. I kind of was at the tail end of this when I started. There was still definitely a lot of this thing kind of around in legacy code bases, and honestly, it was always so horrible to work with and just seemed really bizarre. I think floats definitely just have a lot of weird behaviors, and I always sort of struggled to really get my head around them. So this was definitely the era of Bootstrap. Like that was the most popular open source project by far that just had sort of built this whole entire grid just around floats. And then the other thing was just setting display to inline block, which kind of comes with some of its own somewhat undesirable behavior because you get white space even if you set like the margin to be like 0 pixels. And then the solutions for dealing with that are kind of all a bit horrible. I tend to go with just setting the font size to 0 on the parent, and then you have to like reset the font size on all the like the children. Otherwise, obviously, the text just be like unreadable. And so it's still definitely not the ideal layout mechanism. And then eventually, 2014, we got Flexbox, which again, people did build grid systems around this, but it was really primarily just good for like one-dimensional layout, like a nav bar where you just want things to be next to each other, or just stacking things rather than being actually designed for grids. And then finally, wasn't until 2017 that we actually had something in CSS that was specifically designed for doing grid layouts, and it felt like that was the first time in the history of the web already, like after multiple decades, that we finally had a sort of sane way to do layout on websites. But of course, CSS is a hell of a lot more than just using grid and flexbox. I mean, there's hundreds of, I think maybe 500 CSS properties now. So it's kind of just keeps growing as well. It's still very active development. Every month, Chrome's got release notes with a new version coming out, and more often than not, there's a new CSS thing. So I wanted to sort of show like where email kind of fits in on that timeline, and Apple Mail actually kind of just has grown with the web, and it's gone on that same journey, and you can code an email in pretty much an identical way that you could code a web page, and it would work. I mean, there are a few buggy things and maybe one or two things that are missing, but by and large, a front-end developer would be able to use all their skills and wouldn't have to have too much specialist knowledge, and everything would just kind of work by and large. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there is Outlook. And I do want to be specific in saying that I'm talking about Outlook on Windows. There are obviously a lot of different versions of Outlook. There's Outlook on Mac, which has actually always been a really very, very good client, one of the best actually. And then you had the iPhone app and the Android app, which were both basically fine. And then there's Outlook.com, which is mostly okay as well. And so the only one that really required tables was the app on Windows, which eventually is kind of in the process right now of going away. And so I think it was in September 2022, and it's actually like a really distinct memory. I actually was listening to a podcast, and somebody, it was Remy, he was just talking about how there was this beta version of a new version of Outlook that would no longer require tables, and that was the first time I sort of really felt like I could get passionate about email, and I become kind of like a little obsessed about thinking, well, how will we be able to code emails in the future? I started contributing quite a lot to Can I Email. I was just doing all this manual testing. I had just an old Android phone and my own iPhone and a Windows laptop and a Mac, and signed up to every different email account going, and sent myself hundreds of emails trying out things like display grid and Flexbox and all these new CSS features, just to sort of see what email was capable of. So yeah, this is I was testing in all sorts of clients, but obviously these are the most popular ones, as I'm sure most of us are aware of. So yeah, this was from a Microsoft presentation all the way back in 2020, where they were talking about what their grand vision was for this new version of Outlook. They were talking about things like a common architecture, they were talking about consistency, and they were talking about building on top of web technology, because the experience and the whole code base was totally different for every version of Outlook out there. So the version on Mac, totally not only different from the version on Windows, totally different from the web app, Outlook.com. And so this really was uh, a vision to take this very fragmented landscape and kind of unify it and have something much more consistent. And then by 2022, that you could actually test it in beta. But it's been this really long journey. They've not always been great at updates as far as timescales. So the most recent update that we've had was from September of last year. At the time, people still had to opt in. At the moment, you actually have to opt out. Well, or at least most people will be using it sort of by default, and then if you opt out, you're still allowed to. Obviously, eventually, the old version won't exist anymore, and you won't have an option to opt out, and you'll just be stuck with it whether you like it or not. So that can't come soon enough, but it's this very incremental thing. It's very gradual. I'm amazed that they're doing it over such a long time period, but yeah. It's going to be a while. But I think one thing that's happening quite a bit quicker is the total death of Windows Mail. So, and I talked about Windows having this very fragmented landscape of different clients. And Windows Mail was every bit as bad as Outlook on Windows. By the end of 2024, it really just won't exist at all anymore, is my understanding. And if you currently do insist on opening it, this is the message you'll get. Just says that Outlook is the new version of Outlook is going to replace Windows Mail. So that is very, very good news. And that is a very sort of forceful update that they're doing. And the new version of Outlook is going to become like the default email client for anyone on Windows 11. But obviously, there are going to be people who are stuck on older versions of Outlook. So my understanding is that people on Outlook 2021 will be stuck with the Word rendering engine. And so that is officially maintained by Microsoft until October 2026. So that's less good. And yeah, I'm not going to tell anybody like when they should or should not kind of consider changing their coding practices. But I think one thing to keep in mind is that even though we test our emails, I'm sure there are always probably bugs that we maybe miss quite a lot of time. So I did find this comment from Mark really interesting, that a lot of the time by using tables and by doing all these sort of weird, arcane, bizarre coding practices to purely to make things work in Windows Outlook, you're actually creating problems for people using other clients, because realistically, web browsers are not designed for the kind of weird stuff we do, like for Outlook. You know, all of that sort of table within table within table is like, it's just not a web standard. It's not really what anything was designed for, and so it's not surprising that it is going to cause issues elsewhere. So I think that's maybe worth bearing in mind. Um, so this is a handy chart from Can I Email, just basically ranking different email clients based on how many CSS features they support. Unsurprisingly, Apple Mail is right at the top, and Outlook's for Windows is right at the bottom. And I do have some bad news, which is probably, hopefully, the only bad news of the talk, which is that Outlook on Mac is actually going to get significantly worse, because as I was kind of talking about, a big part of this vision from Microsoft is that they want more consistency. They want sort of a unified code base. They want to be using web technology, and to kind of be sharing code between their different clients. And so Outlook on macOS is going to become, I think, pretty much indistinguishable in what it supports. Pretty much indistinguishable from Outlook.com. But then obviously the good news is that Outlook on Windows will become significantly better, and we should be in a place where Outlook's just Outlook, and it won't have too many differences between platforms. So that will simplify things. And then here is just a handy chart again from Can I Email, where obviously the very red column is Outlook. And this is obviously quite a lot of data to take in, but of all the hundreds of CSS properties out there, if we sort of filter it down to ones that we typically want to use like every day as a developer, these are things that will now be available across all clients. I mean, there might be little caveats here and there, but by and large, these are all safe to use now. So that's amazing. But obviously, Outlook on Windows was not the only thing holding back email. And so there's also a fair amount that isn't available. Although also maybe worth just calling out some of the things here. I mean, these are all very long established features, so it's crazy that we've not had across the board. AVIF images is a lot more recent. That's actually only just being implemented in Edge browser. I think maybe in a few days from now is the next stable release. And if anyone heard of WebP, which is a modern image format, AVIF is an even more modern image format. So it's just a replacement for PNG or JPEG, which it will allow the sort of same quality of image, but a much smaller file size, like a really shockingly smaller file size. It's definitely the best image format out there, and that's pretty much supported across the board now. So that's really good news. And yeah, this is just, again, to reiterate how much CSS has grown over the years. So we've got the sort of first edition of the definitive guide to CSS, and then it's the second edition, and then the third edition. And I think this photo was actually taken a while ago. So it's grown even since then, but if we really focus on the sort of important stuff, because I could talk all day about things that is missing from email, but these are such basic, long established properties that unfortunately, even after Outlook gets its update and everyone's using that, we still can't use some pretty basic stuff. The only one of these that's relatively new is container queries. That would be super useful for emails because a lot of the time emails aren't in an iframe. I mean, I think Gmail and Yahoo web clients, they don't use iframes. And so you're doing your media query and it's telling you the size of the entire browser window rather than the size of your email. And so a container query would be much more useful than a media query, but unfortunately we can't use that yet. And also because emails don't necessarily use iframes, it also means that things like position absolute and z index are probably just never going to be supported by email because otherwise things in your email could overlap the actual UI of the email client, which would not be good. Some of these you can obviously use as a progressive enhancement, something like box shadow. It's like if it doesn't work for some people, then it's kind of whatever, fine. And then a gradient, it's very easy to have a backup value. Like you can just have it specify a solid color for those clients that don't support gradients. So I'm not saying you can't use any of these things. Some of them you can use as a progressive enhancement. The prefers color scheme media query is another one that I suppose you can just use, and then if it doesn't work for some people, then that's not too terrible. But then things for layout, it's like you can't really use them at all. I think probably the worst one is box sizing. It's really typical on the web to just set the box sizing of absolutely everything to be border box, and that's kind of what developers are just used to now. Unfortunately, you can't do that in email, which, if anything, one of the most annoying differences, but it's just very hard to get used to as somebody that was much more used to coding websites than emails. And then it's not just CSS properties, it's also the SVG images and plenty of HTML features as well, like the video tag. There are some things that are kind of like nearly there that are kind of like on the cusp, I suppose. I'm not sure how many people use non-Gmail accounts in the Gmail app. I actually am one of those people. I have an Outlook account as my personal email, but I've always opened it inside of the Gmail app on my iPhone. So certainly we're out there. I'd love to see some stats on quite how many people that is, because that is a very limited email client. But so this is basically all of the clients that don't support display flex, because most of them actually do. And then column gap is another one it's kind of like nearly there. Your email on desktop doesn't support it, but other than that, it does have pretty, very broad support, which is maybe surprising for a lot of people. So as far as how should we code emails, given that we don't have access to all of those many CSS properties, I think one of the main things is like the whole float era of CSS is definitely not going to come to email, because I mean this is how you might want a float to look potentially. Floats have a lot of very weird behavior. So if the text is actually smaller than what it's meant to be wrapping around, then its parent just sort of, the height of it just sort of collapses. So that's very odd. And to deal with that, we've always been doing this thing called the clearfix hack, which required like either before or after in CSS, which email doesn't support. There actually is a much more modern alternative, preferable alternative to that nowadays in browsers called display flow root, but that also sadly is not supported by all email clients. So I think using floats without being able to use either the clearfix hack or a display flow root it does just feel a little bit hazardous. So I probably would just avoid it in general. Although I'm sure you can get away with it, depending, like as long as you test it a lot. So for the time being, it seems like we will even after this Outlook update, be stuck using divs and inline block, basically, to put a long story short. But ultimately, the other thing that got me somewhat excited about email was AMP for Email, which was an endeavor from Google. It does seem to have just lost a lot of steam. They've not really been updating it or talking about it at all. I'm not super hopeful for its future, and it does have some weirdnesses. Like after 30 days, your AMP email stops being an AMP email and reverts to being a HTML email. And it's also quite a lot of extra work. You have to provide both a HTML email and a AMP email. So you kind of got to code the same email twice. So it's a lot of extra work for something that only works in, at the moment, Gmail and Yahoo. I think Outlook did do a beta test of it and decided not to go forward with it, which obviously is quite a bad sign. It meant I didn't really feel confident in it as a technology. But what was interesting about AMP for Email, though, I think when people talked about it, they tended to emphasize the fact that it was interactive email and that it could thing. The thing that got me excited about AMP for Email was actually that it just had this consistent, very consistent across the board list of CSS features that were supported. And so if you opened an AMP email in Gmail or in Yahoo, you would know that all the same things were going to be supported. And it was actually a really impressive list of things. And I think part of the reason why CSS properties that don't work in a HTML email that you've opened in Gmail or in Yahoo Mail do work in an AMP email that you've opened in those same browsers is because AMP, I mean, in those same clients, is because AMP is always in an iframe, which is probably why they're a lot more relaxed about what they allow you to use. But yeah, I'm not super confident about the future of AMP, and it's kind of quite a bureaucratic process to even be allowed to send an AMP email, because you actually have to communicate with Google and with Yahoo and sort of get permission to send on. And it's like a whole process. But yeah, that is what it is. And then the other aspect of email coding isn't just thinking about what CSS and HTML features are supported by all these different clients. It's also the tools that we're using, right? It's CSS preprocessors and it's things of that kind. And for a long time, certainly when I sent my first email like 6 years ago, or whenever it was, there really wasn't much. I think all the tooling was focused on marketers or people that wanted to sort of drag and drop. It wasn't focused on people that wanted to code an email sort of from scratch or anything like that. And that has started to change. I mean, Parcel is a very obvious example of that, of something that's kind of specifically built with lots of different features specifically for coders mostly, although I'm sure other people also have a lot of uses for it as well. But then the thing I did want to just sort of call out, we're not going into too much depth on, was these two open source projects, because in front end development, it's become really incredibly common to adopt a component driven approach to things. So you have a component that you've coded at one time, and then you can just reuse it all over the place. And I actually worked on design systems at a friend company for a few years, and our whole purpose was really all about consistency and wanting things to all look like they were the same brand. And I think that's reassuring for consumers that everything looks a certain way when you're interacting with the same company. But delivering that for email was really difficult. I kind of just didn't have it as part of my remit because I just thought I can't even do this. And it's only now I think really that we're getting much more tools that are actually catering to building components that you can use inside of email. I think React Email is still in beta. It's still a very early stage project, although it's already like massively popular just in terms of like GitHub stars, although I think that's mostly with React people rather than like email geeks. It's still a little buggy. I'd say it's probably too early to really want to use that yet, but it's certainly an interesting approach. Obviously, you can't use JavaScript in an email, but it's just using React as a templating language, and it just spits out HTML basically. And then the other one that I've found amazing has been Mazel, which does all sorts of things. It allows you to use Tailwind in your emails, which has become, I'd say, probably the most popular approach to writing CSS for front-end developers. But it also allows you to just define components in quite a simple syntax. And so I've just really loved using Mazel. And yeah,
Hey,
I don't
Ollie,
know. Yeah, that was the
we
end of
are.
it.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I did not mean to cut you off there. Where can people find you to learn more about Outlook? Do you have websites that anyone can visit? There are some questions in the Q&A for you that might be worth it to pop in and answer, but unfortunately, I will have to thank you for your time and sharing all of your insights on Outlook, and bring Hannah on stage for the next. Oh, Ollie's frozen.